The summer Nevada heat doesn't cool at night. It just changes shape. During the day, it comes down from the sky like a punishment. At night, it rises up from the asphalt, from the concrete, from the earth itself, as if the ground has been storing it all day, just waiting for the moment the sun goes down to release everything it's been holding. Riley Cole knew this heat the way she knew hunger, intimately, personally, the way you know something that has never once left you alone. She was 19 years old, 112 pounds of muscle and stubbornness, and she had been sleeping under the Interstate 80 overpass in Reno for the last 3 weeks. Before that, it was a shelter on Virginia Street that closed its doors at 6 in the morning and didn't open again until 7 at night. Before that, it was the back seat of an abandoned Pontiac in Sacramento. Before that, it was a foster home on Maple Grove Drive, where a man named Gerald Finch had told her on the morning of her 18th birthday, with a cup of coffee in his hand and no expression on his face whatsoever, that her time was up. Not his problem anymore. He hadn't been cruel about it. That was almost worse. He'd said it the way you'd tell someone the library was closing. Matter of fact, final. He'd set a black garbage bag on the porch with her clothes in it and gone back inside, and she'd stood there in the early morning Sacramento cold for a long time before she picked up the bag and started walking. 7 months ago. 7 months of learning which dumpsters behind which restaurants had food that was only 1 day past expiration and which ones had food that would make you sick. 7 months of shelter bathrooms where she washed her hair in the sink and dried it with paper towels. 7 months of figuring out which underpasses stayed dry when it rained and which ones flooded. 7 months of being invisible, which was sometimes a curse and sometimes the only thing keeping her safe. Riley was good at two things: staying invisible and fixing engines. The invisible part she'd learned in foster care, where the quieter you were, the less attention you drew, and the less attention you drew, the safer you were. 11 homes in 10 years had taught her that lesson with absolute thoroughness. The engine part was harder to explain. It wasn't something she'd been taught, not formally. She'd picked up pieces here and there, watching mechanics at gas stations, reading manuals she found at thrift stores, spending hours in junkyards that let her wander as long as she didn't steal anything. But the core of it, the deep instinctive part that let her hear a misfiring cylinder in a rough idle or feel a worn bearing through the vibration of a frame, that part had always been there, as long as she could remember, as if it had been handed down to her through blood rather than instruction. She'd been turning that thought over for years without knowing what to do with it. In her left jacket pocket, worn soft as skin from years of handling, was a photograph. She'd stolen it when she was 16 from the unlocked desk drawer of her foster mother on Cypress Lane, a woman named Doreen who drank white wine from a coffee mug and kept things she never talked about. Riley had gone looking for the drawer on a night when Doreen had fallen asleep on the couch at 7:30, the mug still in her hand. She hadn't known what she was looking for, just that Doreen's guilt about something had been visible for months in the way she couldn't quite meet Riley's eyes. And Riley had learned early that guilt meant secrets, and secrets sometimes meant answers. The photograph was small, 3 inches by 4 inches, the edges yellowed. It showed a pair of hands. Large hands, a man's hands, heavily scarred across the knuckles, stained deep with oil that had worked its way into the skin so permanently it had become part of it. The hands were holding a torque wrench over a Harley-Davidson engine, the kind of work grip that meant the person holding that wrench had been holding wrenches for decades. On the back, in faded blue ink, 3 lines: Raymond Cole, 2006, best mechanic I ever knew. Riley had stared at that name for a long time. Then she'd looked at her own hands, the shape of the knuckles, the way her fingers naturally curled. The scar on her left thumb she'd gotten at 14 when a socket wrench slipped on a rusty bolt in a Sacramento junkyard. She'd stolen the photograph. Doreen never mentioned it. Riley had carried it every day since. Raymond Cole was the only clue she had to the questions she'd been asking her entire life. The caseworkers had told her nothing useful. Father unknown, the file said. She'd found that phrase in a document when she was 12, and sat with it for 3 days straight, trying to understand how a person could be unknown, as if he'd never existed, as if she'd appeared from nowhere. But someone had taken that photograph. Someone had known Raymond Cole well enough to write those words on the back. And whoever that someone was, they'd kept it hidden in a locked drawer for reasons Riley couldn't guess. She didn't know if Raymond Cole was alive or dead. She didn't know what he looked like beyond those hands. She didn't know if he'd ever known she existed, but she knew the shape of his knuckles matched hers, and she knew that the work in those hands was the same work that had lived in her hands since before she could name it. That was enough to carry. On a Tuesday morning in late July, Riley was going through the dumpster behind a truck stop on the east side of Reno. Not desperately, methodically. There was a difference, and she'd learned to live in that difference. Desperation made you sloppy. Method kept you fed. She was looking for copper wiring, maybe some aluminum she could sell to the scrapyard on Industrial Boulevard. The truck stop mechanics threw away more usable material than most people realized. Belts that had a few hundred miles left, fittings that could be cleaned and reused. Occasionally a tool that someone had deemed not worth fixing. The flyer was taped to the side of the dumpster. Rain had curled its edges and a grease stain covered one corner, but the words were clear enough in the flat morning light. Mechanic wanted, no experience required. $10,000 cash, Iron Legion MC, an address in the industrial district south of downtown. And at the bottom, a logo she recognized immediately. An eagle skull with wings spread wide wrapped in chains. The Hells Angels affiliation mark. Riley peeled the flyer off the dumpster carefully, smoothed it against her thigh. Iron Legion MC. Everyone in Nevada knew the name. One of the largest Hells Angels chapters in the western United States. 700 active members, a compound on the south edge of Reno that looked from the outside like something between a military installation and a maximum security facility. 12-foot concrete walls, razor wire, security cameras on every corner. Men who had been hardened by decades of road and weather and the kind of life that left marks you could read from across a room. No experience required. That phrase didn't make sense next to that logo. Iron Legion didn't do things without reason. They didn't advertise. They didn't ask for people who didn't know what they were doing. Either the job was a trap of some kind, or it was something so impossible that experience had stopped mattering because everyone qualified had already failed. Riley folded the flyer carefully and put it in her pocket next to the photograph of her father's hands. She stood next to the dumpster for a long time watching a hawk circle something in the pale morning sky. Then she picked up her bag and started walking south. It took her 2 days on foot. She arrived at the Iron Legion compound at 7:30 in the morning on a Thursday before the heat had fully committed to its daily brutality. The compound was exactly what the story said. The concrete walls were higher than she'd imagined, the razor wire at the top catching the early light in tiny, brilliant flashes. The American flag hanging from the center pole was enormous, bigger than the wall of most houses she'd lived in. The gates were solid steel, painted flat black, the skull and wings logo welded directly into the metal at eye level. Riley pressed the intercom button. Static. Then a voice that sounded like gravel being poured down a metal pipe. State your business. She'd been rehearsing this part for 2 days. Kept it simple. I'm here about the mechanic job. A silence long enough that she thought maybe they'd simply decided not to respond. She counted the security cameras she could see from where she was standing. 9 from this angle. There were certainly more. Then stay there. She stayed. The Nevada sun began its climb. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck. She didn't move. She'd learned patience the way she'd learned most things out of necessity until it became second nature. The gate opened with a sound like a held breath being released. Hydraulic. Precise. The man on the other side was the largest human being Riley had encountered outside of a television screen. 6'4" at least. Shoulders that seemed to require their own separate consideration. Arms covered from wrist to collar in tattoos so dense they become their own landscape skulls and eagles in scripture, in fonts she couldn't read at this distance, and names of people who were no longer alive. His head was shaved smooth. Two fingers were missing from his left hand, the ring finger, and the pinky gone cleanly at the second knuckle. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit the category you'd prepared for. "You the one about the job?" It wasn't a question, exactly. More of an inventory. "Yes, sir. I'm Riley. Don't need your name yet." He studied her with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned long ago that first impressions were less reliable than the second and third ones. His name tag on his vest said Stone. Below that, Sergeant at Arms. "You look like you haven't eaten in a week." Riley's stomach had been a tight knot of hunger since yesterday afternoon, but she kept her voice level. "I haven't, but I can fix your bike." Stone looked at her for 10 full seconds without speaking. She met his eyes and didn't look away. She'd learned in 7 months of street life, and before that in 11 foster homes, that looking away was an invitation for people to decide things about you. She had no interest in people deciding things about her. Something moved behind Stone's expression. Not warmth. Not quite. More like the look of a man who has already spent everything he had on a bet that keeps losing and has decided he has nothing left to risk by placing one more. 65 certified mechanics tried, he said. Factory-trained Harley techs. Engineers. One man who built racing engines for professional circuits. "You look like a strong wind would pick you up and carry you to the next county." Riley said maybe, but I'm stubborn. Stone almost smiled. The muscles around his mouth moved in that direction and then thought better of it. "Come on then, but girl, you waste my time. You don't walk out the way you walked in." You understand me? She understood him. The clubhouse smelled like history being slowly dissolved in motor oil and whiskey in decades of cigarette smoke that had worked its way so deep into the walls it had become structural. The concrete floor was dark with oil stains that predated everyone currently living. The leather on every surface was worn to the soft finish of something that had been touched 10,000 times by 10,000 hands. Photographs covered every wall from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of them. Men on motorcycles on empty highways. Men at rallies in the blazing sun with their arms around each other. Men laughing men, serious men, caught in the unguarded moments that cameras sometimes find between the posed ones. And scattered throughout the memorial photographs. Men with dates beneath their names. Faces frozen at whatever age they'd been when the road or the years or something else had taken them. Patches with wings added. Patches that said in memoriam above names that the surviving members clearly still said out loud, because the dead don't disappear from a family, they just change their form. Riley looked at every photograph she passed and kept her face still. Stone led her through the main hall, past a bar with bottles lined up in the dim light, past pool tables scarred from years of use, past a wall covered in patches from chapters all over the country and beyond. Iron Legion wasn't just a Nevada club. They were everywhere. She'd known that. Seeing the evidence of it was different from knowing it. They stopped at a garage bay at the back of the building. The space looked like a war had been fought in it and lost. Workbenches shoved against walls at angles that suggested they had been moved in frustration. Diagnostic computers still plugged in their screens dark, their work abandoned. Tools scattered across the floor with the randomness of things dropped by people who'd stopped caring about where they landed. Socket sets, torque wrenches, oscilloscopes, multimeters with their leads coiled and left, and covering the walls taped up in the handwriting of 65 different people over years of attempts notes. Riley moved close enough to read several of them. Compression, perfect. Timing, perfect. Oil pressure, nominal. No mechanical explanation for failure. Walked away. Electrical system, flawless. Every diagnostic shows 0 fault codes. Engine screams on ignition. Cannot explain. Cannot fix. I'm done. Something wrong with this bike that no machine can measure. I've never quit a job in 30 years. I'm quitting this one. She read them all, or as many as she could find. Each one was a different handwriting, a different voice, but they all arrived at the same place. Perfect, impossible, defeated. In the center of the garage bay, draped in a cloth of black silk embroidered with silver thread, sat the motorcycle. Even covered it had a presence, the way certain things do. The way a room changes when something important is in it, when the air itself seems to rearrange around the fact of a thing. Stone stopped in front of it. He put one hand on the covered frame and left it there. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter than she'd heard from him before. $2.5 million, he said. 18 years of work. Every single one of our 700 brothers gave what they could. Some gave thousands. Some gave their last $20 because it was what they had and the bike was what mattered. He paused. There's a man in this club named Earl, 79 years old. He'd been riding since he was 16. He had an original 1965 shovelhead that he'd owned for 30 years. That bike was worth $80,000. He sold it for 50 just to meet our deadline. He wept when he handed over the keys. Riley didn't speak. She didn't trust what her voice would do. This bike was supposed to lead our 50th anniversary ride, Stone continued. 700 riders, California to Maine, 4 weeks on the road. We were going to show the country what brotherhood looks like. National media was going to cover it. He paused again, longer this time. But it doesn't run. It hasn't run since the man who built it died. 19 years ago. He gripped the edge of the silk cloth. It runs for 13 seconds. Perfect, smooth, powerful, and then it screams. Not the way a mechanical problem sounds. It screams the way something alive screams, high and desperate and wrong. It makes grown men step back. 3 mechanics I know of left their tools on the floor and never came back to collect their pay. $15,000 each, just sitting there. They were that shaken. He pulled the cloth away slowly. The fabric slid back like a curtain being raised on something that had been waiting a long time for its audience. Chrome found the light first, so perfectly polished that Riley could see her own reflection in it distorted and elongated, a thin ghost of herself looking back. Then the paint. Midnight black, but not flat black, not simple black. Black with depth in it, black with metallic flake suspended through it, that shifted color as the light changed blue and purple and green, moving through the darkness like something living beneath the surface. And carved into the tank in silver in script so fine it must have required tools that didn't exist in normal garages, 700 names. Spiraling around a centerpiece of an eagle skull with wings and actual silver inlay, each feather individually detailed, the chains wrapping it rendered link by link. Riley forgot how to breathe for a moment. The frame was a 1958 Harley-Davidson panhead base, but nothing else was original. The frame had been reinforced with hand-forged titanium work that would have cost $200,000 in materials alone. The engine was a custom 1,800 cubic centimeter monster twin turbos, feeding a polished intake manifold that belonged in a different world than the one it occupied, gold-plated internal components visible through a cutaway inspection window on the side case. Every bolt was engraved. Every surface was art. Not the decorative kind. The kind of art that comes from someone who understood that beauty and function are not opposites. They're the same thing when you do the work right. Riley walked around it slowly. Her hands stayed at her sides. She wasn't ready to touch it yet. You don't touch something like this until you have earned the right. Who built it, she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Stone said a man named Raymond Cole. The world did something Riley had no category for. It didn't stop. It didn't rearrange itself in any visible way. The garage stayed the same. The chrome still caught the light, the same way Stone still stood in the same position with the same expression. But something in the space between her ribs shifted so violently that she had to put one hand on the nearest workbench to keep her balance, and she turned the motion into reaching for something, made it look purposeful. Raymond Cole, the name she'd read on the back of a photograph 10,000 times. The name she'd spoken in her head late at night under overpasses and in shelter bathrooms and on cold concrete floors when she needed to feel like she was talking to someone. The man who had built this impossible machine was her father. Stone was still talking. She heard him through something like water. Best mechanic this club ever had. Could build anything. Fix anything. This bike was his masterpiece. He spent the last 6 years of his life on it. Died before it ever ran. Massive heart attack in this garage right where you're standing. They found him with a park wrench still in his hand. Stone's jaw tightened. Been cursed ever since. Riley stood very still and looked at the bike and did not say the thing that was pressing against the inside of her teeth with enormous force. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm instead, the old habit, the one she developed at 7 years old in her second foster home when she needed to stay quiet and still. The small pain that kept the larger things contained. What does it do, she managed to ask, when you try to start it? 13 seconds. Perfect. Then the scream, high-pitched like metal tearing but wrong too high for that, makes your back teeth ache. Then it shuts off completely. Won't restart for hours regardless of what you try. Every diagnostic says everything is perfect. Compression timing, electrical fuel delivery, all of it perfect. Stone shook his head. There's nothing wrong with it according to any machine ever brought in here. But it screams and dies. Riley made one slow circuit of the motorcycle and let her eyes do the work her hands weren't doing yet. Looking for the obvious things first. Wiring anomalies. Evidence of amateur repair work on top of professional work. Anything that would show why 65 trained mechanics had failed. Then she saw it, on the lower engine case near the base of the primary drive housing. A weld, small, maybe an inch long. The color was fractionally different from the surrounding metalwork, lighter by a shade, and the technique was distinct from the rest of the weld work on the engine. Not inferior, different, done deliberately. And next to the weld, stamped into the metal in characters barely 2 millimeters high, RC plus D. She crouched down and brought her face close to the metal and looked at those characters for a long time without touching them. RC plus D, Raymond Cole plus daughter, her father had known. Riley stood up slowly. She understood immediately and with complete clarity why she was not going to tell Stone what she just read. It wasn't strategy. It was something older and more fundamental than that. She had spent her entire life being measured before she proved anything placed in categories, before she demonstrated who she was handed outcomes based on circumstance rather than her own work. She was not going to walk into this on her father's name. She was not going to be given anything here. She was going to earn it with her own hands, or she was not going to have it at all. Raymond Cole had built a test. She intended to pass it on its own terms. "When do I start?" she said. Stone nodded once. The kind of nod you give when something confirms what you'd suspected but hadn't let yourself believe yet. Now, you've got 72 hours. After that, the club votes on scrapping it for parts. The anniversary ride date has passed. Half the brothers want to move on. You're the last chance this bike gets. Riley looked at the motorcycle one more time. At the 700 names carved into the tank. At the silver inlay work that had taken someone years to complete. At the chrome that held her reflection. She thought about what it meant that her father had stamped those two characters into the engine case. That he'd built this trap, this puzzle, this impossible machine, and put her initial next to his. RC plus D. Not in the obvious places. Not where 65 mechanics would find it during their desperate searches. Hidden in a place you would only find if you were patient enough to look slowly. "I'll need coffee," she said. "Real coffee if you have it. And I'll need the garage to myself. I work better without an audience." Stone studied her one more time. Then he turned and walked toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame. "There's one thing I need you to understand before I leave you alone with it," he said. He spoke without turning around. "If you make it run and then it turns out you did something to damage it further, there's nowhere in this state you'll be safe. You understand what I'm saying to you. She understood exactly what he was saying to her. I understand. He left. Riley stood alone in the garage with her father's masterpiece. For 6 hours, she didn't touch a single bolt. She sat cross-legged on the concrete floor 10 feet from the motorcycle and looked at it. Just looked. She moved around it periodically, changing her angle, getting closer, and then farther away, looking at it with the garage lights on, and then turning one bank of lights off and looking at it with the remaining shadows. She read every note on every wall, taking photographs with her cracked screen phone. She pulled the previous mechanic's diagnostic printouts from a folder Stone had left on the workbench and read through each one carefully. Perfect compression, perfect timing, perfect fuel delivery, perfect electrical, perfect oil pressure during the 13 seconds of operation. Then the scream, then silence, then nothing any machine could explain. The notes from the mechanics who'd given up the most slowly, who'd worked the longest before walking away, were the most interesting. They all said the same thing in different ways. It's not mechanical. Everything mechanical is right. Something else is wrong that I don't have a word for. Riley had learned something in 7 months of living outside that the mechanics with their certifications and their diagnostic equipment might not have learned yet. That sometimes the problem isn't what's broken. Sometimes the problem is what was put there on purpose. Drift found her at 9 that evening. He came in without announcing himself and sat on an overturned crate in the far corner of the garage and said nothing. He was younger than most of the club members she'd seen, maybe mid-30s, lean and quiet with the stillness of someone who had learned to make themselves small in a room. His patches said his road name was Drift and his rank was member. He had a fading scar along his jawline, and his hands, she noticed, were mechanic's hands, stained and capable. She watched him out of the corner of her eye and said nothing, and he said nothing, and that went on for an hour. Fine with her. Stone came by at 10 with real coffee, a proper cup from a proper machine, dark and bitter and worth the description. He set it on the workbench without a word and stood for a moment watching her work the room with her eyes rather than her hands. You're different from the others, he said finally. She didn't look up from the diagnostic printout she was reviewing. They came in talking. Stone continued, telling us what they knew, talking about their credentials, their experience. Every single one of them had his hands on the engine within 10 minutes of walking in here. You've been here all day and haven't touched it. My father taught me that engines talk if you listen first. She said it without thinking. The words were out before she could evaluate them. Stone went quiet. She felt him looking at the side of her face. Your dad a mechanic? She kept her eyes on the printout. Yeah, he was. Good one, the best, from what I understand. Stone nodded slowly. Mine was too. Taught me everything I know about machinery before I ever touched a motorcycle. Died when I was 24. Stroke. She heard something real in his voice, the resonance of grief that has been carried long enough to become weight rather than wound. You never stop missing a man who gave you your hands, he said. No, Riley said. You don't. Stone finished his coffee. He set the cup down and looked at the motorcycle for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize as the combination of love and desperation that the whole club seemed to hold toward this machine. You've got until Sunday morning, he said. Then he left again. Riley turned back to the bike. At midnight, she began the teardown. She started with the outer covers, working carefully and methodically, photographing each component before removal, numbering each bolt in her phone's camera roll, laying everything out on clean shop rags in the order it came off. She worked from the outside in the way you approach something when you're trying to understand it rather than just fix it. The quality of the workmanship was extraordinary. Every surface she uncovered was machined to tolerances she'd never seen outside of aerospace applications. Every internal component was finished to a smoothness that shouldn't have been achievable by hand. Her father had operated at a level that the other mechanics had apparently recognized but not understood. She could see why. It was the kind of work that made other craftsmen feel like amateurs. Not because it was showing off, because every decision had been made for a reason that went deeper than function. By 2 in the morning, she had the primary drive system off and was working on the engine access panels. Drift was still in the corner, still silent. She'd stopped being aware of him as a presence separate from the room. At 3:17 in the morning, she found the first one. She was removing the lower engine case access plate, a section that most of the previous mechanics had apparently examined but not fully disassembled, and there it was. A small titanium cylinder, maybe 4 centimeters long, sealed at both ends with threaded caps. It was welded into a recess that had been machined directly into the case, a recess that shouldn't have existed in any standard or custom engine build. The cylinder was bathed in the oil flow path, positioned to receive direct oil circulation, but protected from mechanical contact by its recess. Riley sat back on her heels and stared at it. She examined the surrounding metalwork with her flashlight. The weld that sealed the cylinder into the case was precise and deliberately blended to match the surrounding surface. It would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. She found 5 more, each one in a different location within the engine, different systems, different oil flow paths, but each one positioned in the same fundamental way. Bathed in oil, protected from contact, sealed, each one had a number engraved on its surface, 1 through 6, and each one was marked with her father's initials. RC Experimental Compound 1, RC Experimental Compound 2, on up to 6. She removed them carefully one by one and laid them on a clean shop rag. The 6th one, when she unscrewed its cap with a precision screwdriver, released a fine gray powder that caught the garage light in a way that was both metallic and soft. She rubbed a small amount between her fingers, abrasive, fine-grained, dense. Her heart was beating in her ears. This was the problem. Whatever this compound was, it had been in these cylinders for 19 years, slowly releasing into the engine's oil system with every heat cycle, every vibration, every change in pressure, circulating through the oil to every bearing surface, every valve guide, every piston ring, grinding, wearing, destroying precision surfaces from the inside while every external diagnostic reported nothing wrong. Because nothing was wrong with the external systems. Everything wrong was invisible, microscopic. The kind of damage that would only show itself as friction at high RPM as surfaces worn past their tolerances, vibrating at frequencies that the engine was never designed to produce. The scream, the engine wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was being systematically destroyed by something her father had put inside it on purpose. Riley opened each of the other 5 cylinders. Same powder, same consistency, same result over 19 years of slow release. She searched for a 7th. The numbering implied one was missing. She searched the engine carefully for another 30 minutes, checking every surface, every recess, every possible location. Nothing. Then she stepped back and looked at the whole assembly from a wider angle and thought about it the way her father must have thought about it. Where would she put the 7th one if she wanted it found last? After everything else had been discovered. After whoever was looking had proven themselves thorough enough to keep searching. She looked at the frame. The frame was the foundation of everything. Reinforced with titanium custom build, the most structurally complex part of the whole motorcycle. She began examining the frame wells with her flashlight, working from the front down. She found it behind the lower rear support beam, a section of the frame that would require moving 2 engine mounts to access properly, a location that would only reveal itself after significant disassembly. The 7th cylinder was larger than the others, nearly twice the size, and it wasn't just welded in. It was integrated into the frame structure itself, part of the load-bearing design. Riley removed the engine mounts carefully, working around the partially disassembled engine, and got her hands on the 7th cylinder. It didn't have powder in it. When she unscrewed the cap, what she found was a roll of paper. Thin paper, the kind used for technical drawings, rolled tight and wrapped in a layer of plastic sheeting that had kept the oil from destroying it over 19 years. Alongside it, wrapped in the same protective plastic, was a separate fold of documents she set aside to examine after the letter. She unrolled the letter on the cleanest section of workbench she could find and read it in the garage light, with her heart making a sound in her chest that she could feel in her hands. The handwriting was neat and precise, the letters of someone who worked with detail for a living, who understood that imprecision had consequences. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this letter, it means I am gone. And it means this motorcycle has defeated every mechanic who attempted to repair it. That is exactly what I designed it to do. The compounds in those cylinders were not destroying the engine randomly. They were testing you, testing your patience, testing your attention, testing whether you understood that some problems are put there on purpose by someone who needed the answer to a question they couldn't ask out loud. Remove the cylinders, clean the entire oil system completely, rebuild the damaged bearing surfaces and ring lands to original tolerances. Do it right and this engine will run better than it ever has. Do it wrong and it will scream again and you will never understand why. But here is what I need you to understand before you do any of that. I built this trap for one person. I never got to meet my daughter. Her mother left before she was born, and I didn't learn of her existence until my health was already failing. I spent 3 years searching through what records I could access. The foster system is a wall that fathers with no legal claim cannot climb. I got close twice. Both times the trail went cold. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I built something. I built this motorcycle for the Iron Legion because they are the family I chose and they deserve the masterpiece I had in me. But I built what's inside it for my daughter because I knew in the way you know things that you cannot prove and cannot explain that she would end up here. She has my hands. She has my mind. She has the stubbornness that has gotten me into trouble my entire life and gotten me out of it just as often. If you are not my daughter, you found these words by accident, and you should put this letter back and pretend you never saw it, because what comes next is not for you. If you are my daughter, then you already know what I'm about to say. I loved you before I met you. I loved you from the moment I learned you existed. I failed you by not finding you in time, and there is no version of that failure that I can make right from where I am now. I know that. But I could leave you this. Fix this engine. Prove what you carry in your hands. And when the bike runs, you will have what I always wanted to give you in person. A home. The people who surround this machine are flawed and complicated and sometimes frightening, and they are the most loyal family I have ever known. They will be yours too if you earn it. You have my hands. You already have. With all the love I have left to give. Raymond Cole, your father. Riley read the letter 3 times. The garage was very quiet around her. Drift was still in the corner. She didn't know if he was awake or asleep, and it didn't matter. The letter was a lifetime of questions answered in 3 pages of neat handwriting, and she sat with it in the harsh garage light and let the weight of it move through her. Her father had known she would come, had built an impossible machine not to defeat everyone who tried to fix it, but to wait for the one person who would approach it the way he'd approached everything, with patience and attention and the stubbornness that was apparently genetic. He'd built a test that could only be passed by someone who thought the way he thought. She was crying. She realized it when a tear fell onto the plastic wrapping that had protected the letter, and she watched it beat and roll. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes once and took a long breath. Then she folded the letter and put it inside her jacket against her left side, next to where the photograph lived. She picked up the separate fold of documents and read through them carefully in the garage light. Medical records, a name she didn't recognize yet, a timeline of illness and treatment, payment records showing her father's bank account drained to zero across 2 years of specialist fees. She read every page twice and then folded them back into their protective plastic and placed them in her jacket alongside the letter. She stood up. She turned back to the engine. She looked at the 6 cylinders lined up on the shop rag and the damage she now understood they'd been causing for 19 years, slow and invisible and methodical. There was work to do. Her father had left her a test and a message and a home if she was strong enough to earn it. She picked up her tools. Outside, somewhere beyond the compound walls, the Nevada night was doing what it always did, holding its heat and its silence and its vast indifference to the things people carried through it. But in the garage, under the fluorescent lights, with her father's masterpiece in pieces around her and his letter over her heart, Riley Cole began the work she had been built for. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. She understood why now. The night passed the way hard work makes time pass, not quickly, not slowly, just completely every minute filled with something that mattered until the darkness outside the garage windows went from black to gray to the pale gold that precedes a Nevada sunrise. Riley had not slept. She had not intended to sleep. By 4 in the morning, she had completed the full teardown. Every component of the engine was laid out on shop rags across 3 workbenches, numbered, photographed, cataloged. The 6 titanium cylinders sat in a row at the end of the nearest bench, like evidence. The oil system had been drained completely into a catch basin, the contaminated fluid dark with 19 years of compound residue. The color of it made her jaw tighten. Whatever her father had formulated in those capsules had done its work thoroughly. She documented everything before she touched anything for cleaning. Not because she'd been asked to, because the work demanded it. Because her father's letter had said to do it right, and doing it right meant understanding fully before acting. Drift was still in the corner when the first light came through the high windows. She'd forgotten him for hours at a time, which was apparently what he intended. When she finally looked over, he was awake, sitting with his elbows on his knees, watching her work with an expression that held something she couldn't immediately name. "You haven't stopped," he said. It was the first thing he'd said in 6 hours. Riley set down the caliper she'd been using to measure a bearing journal. "I'll stop when it's done." Drift nodded slowly. He looked at the components spread across the workbenches, the ordered disassembly, the methodical documentation. He said quietly and almost to himself, "He worked exactly like that." Riley kept her face still. "Who did?" "Raymond." Drift paused. "I knew him. For about 4 years before he passed. He took me on when I had nothing, when no one else would look at me. He was the kind of man who saw what people could be rather than what they were at the moment he met them." Riley said nothing. She picked up the caliper again. "I watched him build parts of this bike," Drift said. "Not the final assembly that was private, he did the last stages alone, but the early work, the frame fabrication, some of the engine components. He worked the same way you do, like the job deserved his entire attention, and giving it anything less would be a kind of disrespect to the material." He stood up from the crate and moved toward the door. "I'll get you breakfast," he said. "Real breakfast. You need it." He left before she could tell him she didn't need anything. He came back 20 minutes later with eggs and toast and fruit from somewhere in the compound kitchen. He set it on the one clean corner of workbench she'd maintained and left again without another word. Riley ate without stopping her examination of the bearing surfaces, reading the wear patterns. The compounds had left them, learning the damage before she began to address it. Stone arrived at 7. He stood in the doorway of the garage and looked at the full teardown spread across the workbenches and was quiet for a long moment. Riley watched him process it without interrupting. "You took it all the way down," he said finally. She said, "The problem is in the oil system. Someone put experimental compounds inside the engine years ago, 6 capsules hidden in custom recesses, each one releasing material into the oil flow. 19 years of contamination. Every bearing surface in this engine has been slowly degraded from the inside. The diagnostics all read perfect because the external systems are perfect. The damage is microscopic but cumulative. At 13 seconds of high RPM operation, the degraded surfaces reach a vibration frequency that the engine wasn't designed to produce. That's the scream. Stone stared at her. Someone put them there on purpose? Yes. Why? She met his eyes. I don't know yet. She said it without difficulty because it was technically true. She didn't know why in any sense that she was prepared to share with him yet. Stone looked at the components for another long moment. What do you need? She handed him the list she'd been building since 3 in the morning. Custom bearings to specific tolerances. New piston rings, custom diameter. Gaskets for the primary and secondary systems. Valve guides, 4 of them. Precision machine work on 2 of the cylinder walls. He read through it. Most of this isn't stock. It's custom spec. I know. Your club's machine shop. Whoever does your precision work, they'll need the measurements I've documented. She held up her phone. I have everything photographed and noted. Stone folded the list and put it in his vest pocket. He looked at her one more time with the expression of a man who has run out of conventional expectations and is watching something happen that he doesn't have a category for yet. I'll make calls, he said. After he left, Riley worked through the cleaning process. Every component by hand in the correct sequence, with the correct solvents, the way her father's notes had implied through the quality of the original work rather than saying outright. You could read a craftsman's instructions in the work itself if you knew how to look. She knew how to look. She was cleaning the 4th bearing cap when she heard the first voice. It came from the direction of the main hall. Male loud, carrying the confidence of someone who has no interest in moderating himself for the benefit of those within earshot. She's been in there all night and she hasn't fixed a thing, just torn it apart further. That sound like fixing to you, another voice lower answering. Then the first voice again. 65 men couldn't do it. You think some girl who showed up at the gate with grease on her hands and nothing else is going to crack what they couldn't? Stone's losing his mind. We're throwing good money after nothing. Riley kept cleaning the bearing cap. Her hands didn't change the rhythm. She'd been hearing variations of that voice her entire life. In foster homes and schools and junkyards where she'd gone looking for parts and found men who thought her presence required an explanation. She'd learned a long time ago that the voice didn't stop because you argued with it. It stopped because you did the work until the work was undeniable. She kept going. By noon, Stone had returned with a machinist from Reno named Garrett, who spent 40 minutes with Riley's measurements and then left to begin the precision work. Stone also produced bearings from a specialty supplier in California, delivered by a club member on a bike who'd ridden through the night, and custom gaskets ordered from a fabrication shop in Colorado that apparently had a standing relationship with Iron Legion. The network of it impressed her. The way Stone had moved through her list in 5 hours sourcing materials that would have taken her weeks to locate on her own, using relationships built over decades to get the right components from the right people in the right time frame. This was what a family of 700 looked like when it functioned. She hadn't understood that fully until she watched it work on her behalf. By early afternoon, she'd been awake for 30 hours and was beginning to feel it in the way that exhaustion reaches a certain depth and becomes something you work with rather than against a stripped-down clarity where the unnecessary falls away and what remains is just the work and the hands doing it. She was examining the primary chain tensioner when she heard the sound. Metal scraping against concrete, deliberate and quiet. From the far corner of the garage bay near the storage shelving where the spare oil supply was kept. Riley set down the tensioner without making a sound. She reached over and picked up the flashlight from the workbench. She moved toward the sound along the wall, keeping her footsteps light using the ambient noise of the ventilation system to cover her approach. In the shadows beside the storage shelving, crouched low, a figure was tipping something from a small container into the 5-gallon drum of clean engine oil Stone had set aside for the rebuild. Metal shavings, fresh ones still bright, catching her flashlight beam like scattered sparks. Hey! The figure spun. For a second, she had a direct view. A man's face, middle-aged, hard, in a leather vest with patches she registered, before the man shoved past her with enough force to send her into the shelving and ran. She caught herself on the metal frame and went after him, but her leg, weakened by months of poor nutrition and 30 hours without sleep, wouldn't close the distance. He disappeared into the compound. Stone was in the main hall within 2 minutes of her shout. His expression when she told him what she'd seen was the first time she'd seen him look something other than controlled. Which oil drum? She showed him. He looked at the shavings floating in the surface of the oil, and the muscles in his jaw worked steadily. Road Captain Vest, she said. That's what I saw. I didn't get a name patch. Stone pulled out his phone. His call was short and specific. Church meeting. Everyone on compound. Now, no exceptions. Within 10 minutes, the main hall was full. Riley stood to one side and watched them come in. 40, 50 men ranging from their 20s to their 70s, filling the space with leather and mass and the gravity of people who move through the world in a way that expects to be accommodated. They settled into the hall with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times before a circle that had its own internal logic of rank and seniority. Stone stood at the front. His size alone commanded the room to quiet. Someone in this room, he said, has been sabotaging the build. Riley caught a man in the garage 30 minutes ago dumping metal shavings into our clean oil supply. Road Captain Vest. That's all she got. So I'm going to ask once clean and simple. Step forward now. Last chance to come clean before this becomes something else. The hall was silent. Then from the back, a voice Riley didn't recognize. Flat and deliberate. She's lying, covering for her own failure. The room shifted. Stone's head moved in the direction of the voice. Who said that? A man came forward from the back of the group. He was tall and broad-built, like someone who had spent his life doing physical work, maybe 50, with a shaved head and a dark goatee going gray at the edges. The name patch on his vest said Blade. Below it, Road Captain. His eyes were steady and dark and held the flatness of someone who has been at war with something for so long, the war has become their whole expression. I said it, Blade said. He looked at Riley directly, not with hostility exactly, but with the certainty of someone who has already decided on an outcome. We've wasted 19 years on this bike. Raymond Cole was a fraud who built something that was never meant to run. This girl isn't going to save us. She took the whole engine apart, and now she's pointing fingers to cover up the fact that she can't put it back together. Riley watched him. She said nothing. She was cataloging. Stone said, Blade. You calling her a liar? I'm calling this whole situation a waste of time and brotherhood resources. Blade's voice was controlled, measured. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this position for a long time. We should take the vote on scrapping it. Move on. Use the parts to fund the anniversary ride on whatever bikes we actually own. A few men in the hall shifted their weight. Not in disagreement, Riley noticed. In something more complicated than that. The kind of body language that meant a nerve had been touched. Riley stepped forward. Her voice came out quiet enough that people had to lean slightly to hear it clearly, and that made them pay attention. Explain, she said, why you were in the corner of the garage with a container of metal shavings in your hand over our clean oil. Blade's eyes went to her. Something in them shifted fractionally. Prove it. She held up her phone and turned the screen to face the room. She said I set up a security camera 2 days ago after I noticed my tools had been moved during a period when I wasn't in the garage. I pointed it at the storage area. She hadn't. There was no camera. Her phone screen showed a photograph she'd taken of a wall. But Blade's expression did what expressions do when someone hears a thing they're afraid of. It moved, only for a second, only in the muscles around his eyes and the line of his jaw. But it moved. Several men in the room saw it. Riley watched them see it. You want to destroy this bike, she said, and I want to know why. What did Raymond Cole do to you? The silence in the room changed texture. It became the silence that precedes something true being said. Blade looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its control flatness. What came through instead was something older and rawer, the sound of a wound that had never been allowed to heal properly, because the person carrying it had needed it too much to let it close. Raymond Cole killed my brother, he said. The hall went absolutely still. Blade stood in the center of 50 men with his fists closed at his sides and 19 years of something visible on his face for the first time. His name was Danny Voss, Blade said. He was 19 years old. He was the best kid I ever knew. Patient, talented. He loved motorcycles the way some people love breathing, not as a choice, but as a requirement. He became Raymond Cole's apprentice when he was 18. Youngest one Raymond ever took on. Raymond told him he had a gift, told him he was going to teach him everything. Blade's voice stayed level, but the effort of keeping it that way was visible. 3 weeks into the apprenticeship, Raymond started testing a new compound, an experimental alloy he'd been developing. He didn't tell anyone what it was, didn't tell Danny, just put him to work machining components with it. The dust was fine. You barely saw it. Danny worked with it every day for almost a month. No mask, no ventilation, because nobody told him he needed one. Stone listened to all of it without interrupting. By the time Blade finished speaking about those weeks in the shop, his face had arrived somewhere between grief and fury, and had stopped there, not choosing, either holding both at once. 6 months later, Danny couldn't climb a flight of stairs without stopping to breathe. Blade continued. His lungs were going. The doctors said it was an aggressive industrial exposure particulate matter that had embedded in the lung tissue and was causing progressive fibrosis. They said it was irreversible. They said there was no treatment that could fix what the damage had already done. Only management, slowing it down. Blade looked at the floor. He lived for 2 more years, spent the last 8 months of it on supplemental oxygen. He was 21 years old when he died. Blade raised his eyes. 21. He hadn't even had time to become the mechanic he was going to be. The room was very still. Riley watched the men around her and saw what she'd expected to see. This was not a new story to all of them. Some had heard it before and set it aside. Others were hearing pieces of it for the first time. But all of them were feeling it now, the weight of a 21-year-old with the oxygen gone from his lungs and the future gone from his hands. I brought it to the club at the time, Blade said. I told them what Raymond had done, what his negligence had cost, and I was told that Raymond hadn't known the compound was dangerous, that it was an accident, that Danny's death was a tragedy but not a crime, that Raymond was the heart of this club, and I needed to find a way to move forward. He looked directly at Stone now. So I moved forward. I stayed in the club. I watched them build this bike, his masterpiece, his legacy, the great monument to Raymond Cole. And every time a mechanic got close to fixing it, I made sure they failed. I've been doing it for 19 years. Every one of those 65 mechanics, I had a hand in every single failure. The vote on exiling Blade was called. Stone ran it clean and fast, the way the club conducted its serious business. It didn't pass. 26 in favor, 24 against. The men who had heard Blade's story and understood his grief had voted with their empathy rather than their judgment, and the math wasn't there. Stone looked at the ceiling briefly and then back at the room. Motion fails, Blade stays. But Blade, you go near that bike again, near the parts, near the oil, near anything connected to it, I will handle it personally. That's not a threat. That's a statement of fact. Blade nodded. His expression had gone back to flat. I don't need to touch it anymore, he said. You've got less than 24 hours before the scrapping vote regardless. Even if she fixes it, half this club is with me. He looked at Riley one more time. Nothing personal, girl. Your skills might be real, but some legacies shouldn't survive. He walked out. Riley stood in the center of the room with the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on her. Half this club wants her to succeed. Half have just voted their sympathy with a man who has spent 19 years dismantling everything she's here to save. Stone approached her. He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Can you still do it? She thought about the letter in her jacket. Fix this engine and you will have what I always wanted to give you in person. She thought about the 6 cylinders lined up on the shop rag and the damage they had done and the precise path of repairs she'd been building in her mind for the last 16 hours. Yes, she said, but I need parts I don't have yet, and I need them tonight. Tell me what's missing. She told him. What came next was something Riley had not anticipated and would not forget. She made phone calls at 2 in the morning to numbers she'd collected over 7 months of living outside, people who existed in the same margins she did, who had survived by networks of mutual assistance that the settled world didn't know about because the settled world didn't need to. The junkyard owner in Sacramento, who'd let her dig through his inventory for months in exchange for sorting scrap metal. He answered on the third ring. She explained what she needed. She heard him think for 15 seconds in silence. Then he said, I know a bearing supplier in Fresno who owes me. Give me 2 hours. The truck stop mechanic in Reno, who'd given her cash, worked rebuilding starter motors when she needed to eat. He answered immediately as if he'd been awake. She described the gasket specifications. He said, my brother-in-law runs a fabrication shop in Carson City. I'll call him now, the machinist who taught her precision measurement in exchange for helping him organize his inventory. He didn't answer the first call. He answered the second. She read him the measurements from her phone. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Raymond Cole taught me to read a micrometer. Did you know that? She said she didn't. He said, I'll drive it down myself in the morning. None of them asked why she needed these things at 2 in the morning. None of them asked who it was for. They just asked what and when and whether the measurements were right. This was the other economy, the one that ran on history and trust, and the understanding that when you had nothing, the only currency that worked was showing up for each other. Drift found her at the workbench at 3 after the calls were done, when she was back to cleaning components with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the work is the only thing that exists. He sat across from her and watched her for a while. Then he said, I know who you are. Riley's hands kept moving. She said nothing. Raymond talked about you, Drift said, in the last year before he died. He'd found out about you somehow through some record or contact or I don't know what. He knew he had a daughter. He knew she was in the foster system somewhere in California. He was sick by then. The heart was already giving him trouble, but he was trying to find her. He never told the club officially. It was private to him. But I knew because he trusted me with the things that were private. Riley set down the component she was cleaning. She looked at her hands for a moment. He used to talk about her hands, Drift said quietly. Said he knew she'd have his hands. Said it like he'd met her, like it was a fact rather than a wish. I thought it was the grief talking, the grief of knowing he was running out of time to find her. He tapped his own hands softly against the workbench. You have his hands, Riley said. He put my initial in the engine case. RC plus D, I know. I was there when he did it. He said it was the one thing he could do that would still be there when she arrived. He believed that completely. He never doubted it. He paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, more deliberate. I won't tell, Stone Drift said before she could ask. That's not mine to tell. Raymond wanted you to earn this on your own terms. Not as his daughter, as yourself. There's a difference, and he understood it better than most people ever do. If you walk in there as Riley Cole, who fixed an impossible engine, that's yours forever. If you walk in as Raymond's daughter, you'll always wonder. Riley picked up the cleaning cloth again. She said he used a compound that killed someone, Blade's brother. Drift went quiet. She said, I need to know if he knew it was dangerous. Drift was silent long enough that she looked up at him. He didn't know, Drift said. That's the truth as I know it. He was devastated when Danny got sick. Genuinely destroyed. He paid for every specialist, every treatment, every piece of equipment that boy needed for 2 years. Spent everything he had saved. He believed the compound was safe. He was wrong and a young man died, and Raymond carried that for the rest of his life. But he didn't know there's a difference between a mistake and a crime, and Raymond spent his last years living in that difference, trying to find a way to be worthy of continuing. Riley thought about the medical documents folded in her jacket alongside the letter. She thought about what they said and what her father had done with that knowledge, and what it meant that he'd preserved it inside the same frame that held her letter. Drift stood up. "Get your work done," he said. "I'll be here." The parts arrived throughout the morning hours in the way things arrive when a network of people who have nothing decide together that something matters. A courier on an aging motorcycle delivered the bearings from Fresno at 5:30, still warm from being packed in a hurry. The fabrication shop owner from Carson City arrived at 7, with gaskets he'd made overnight, handing them over with the pride of someone who has done precise work quickly and knows it. The machinist who'd known Raymond drove 3 hours to deliver valve guides he'd machined from midnight to 4, his eyes red from the night's work, and he pressed them into Riley's hands and said he was a good man who carried too much. Make it run right. She worked straight through. The assembly was the reverse of the teardown, but more demanding because now every surface had to be returned to the tolerances her father had originally built to, and those tolerances were tighter than anything she'd encountered before. She measured everything twice and some things 3 times. She used her phone's camera to document each stage, not for the club, but for herself, because she was learning at her father's mind through the reconstruction of his work, and she wanted a record of what she was learning. By midday, she had the bottom end assembled. By mid-afternoon, the top end was going back together with the new valve guides and piston rings installed. By evening, the primary system was rebuilt and torqued to spec. Between the afternoon and evening work, she attended to the blueprints. Hidden inside the frame behind the support beam, where the 7th capsule had been separate from the medical documents she'd already retrieved, was a folded sheet of technical drawings. Her father had drawn detailed schematics for a reinforcement system. Titanium braces to be welded into the frame at 12 stress points, invisible from the outside, but adding structural integrity that would let the engine handle forces it was never originally designed for. At the bottom of the blueprint, a note in Raymond's handwriting. "If someone has been working against what we built, this will save it." Weld points marked in red. "Trust yourself." Dad, he had known about Blade, had anticipated the sabotage, and prepared a countermeasure across the years with the patience of someone who understands that the right preparation outlasts the one who made it. Riley showed Stone the blueprints without explanation beyond the technical requirements. He looked at them for a long time and then arranged for welding equipment and cleared the garage for the hours the work would require. The welding demanded time she didn't have to spare. She worked through the late afternoon and into the early evening, reinforcing the frame at each point her father had marked. The welds had to be precise. Any flaw would create a weak point under the stress of real operation. Her hands were steady until they weren't. At 9 that night, disaster. She was completing the final torque sequence on the head bolts, working in the precise star pattern that her father's original work implied when her hands began to shake. It started in her fingers and moved up through her wrists, and she couldn't stop it. 36 hours without sleep, months of inadequate nutrition, the accumulated stress of everything pressing down at once. Her body was reaching its limit and presenting that limit to her in a way she couldn't negotiate away. The torque wrench wavered. The reading was wrong. She stopped before she made an error she couldn't undo. She sat back on her heels and stared at the engine and breathed. A hand settled over hers. Drift was crouching beside her. His hand was on her hands, steadying them, not taking over, just providing the external stability her internal stability had temporarily run out of. "Breathe," he said. "You're not done. Just breathe." She breathed. He said, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm not a mechanic. I'm just holding you steady until your hands remember what they know." "You understand the difference?" She understood the difference. She breathed again, felt the shaking begin to subside, felt the steadiness return from somewhere underneath the exhaustion from the place where the work lived, the place that apparently ran on something deeper than sleep and food. She completed the torque sequence. When it was done, she sat back and looked at the engine, fully assembled for the first time, and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Recognition, maybe. The way something looks when it has been returned to what it was always meant to be. "Why are you helping me?" she said to Drift. He stood up slowly. He looked at the assembled engine for a moment before he answered. "Raymond Cole gave me a job when I had a felony record and no references, and no one in the legitimate world would look at me," he said. "I was 31 years old, and I had wasted a decade of my life making choices that left marks on my record that followed me everywhere. He hired me anyway, taught me, gave me something to be good at again." He paused. "People like us, the ones the world has written off. We know what it means when someone decides we're worth something. We don't forget it." He looked at her. "You're his. It's in every decision you have made in this garage. Any fool could see it." He moved toward the door. "Get some rest," he said. 2 hours. You have until morning." She lay down on the concrete floor of the garage with her jacket under her head and was asleep in minutes. She dreamed of hands, her father's hands from the photograph and her own hands, and how, when they were placed side by side, the knuckle shapes matched and the scars corresponded, and the way they held a wrench was identical. And in the dream, her father was there, not as a face she had no face to give him, but as a presence, warm and quiet and certain, standing in the garage beside her, looking at the motorcycle they had built together across 19 years and 2 lifetimes of distance. He didn't say anything in the dream. He didn't need to. She woke 2 hours later, with her hands already steady. Garrett, the machinist from Reno, had returned while she slept, bringing the finished cylinder wall work she'd specified. He handed it over and looked at the assembled engine, and after a long silence said, "Raymond always started his torque sequences from the center out, same as you did." Riley didn't ask how he'd known. Some things communicate themselves through the work itself. By the time the sky outside the high windows had gone from black to gray, she had completed the final assembly checks. Oil system flushed 3 times with clean solvent and then filled with fresh oil. Electrical connections verified. Fuel system checked. Every external bolt torqued to the precise specification her father's original work implied. She stood back and looked at the motorcycle as a complete thing. Stone came into the garage at 7 in the morning and stood beside her and looked at the bike without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "Is it ready?" She said, "I need 10 more minutes for a final check." "Then yes," he nodded. He left. She did her final check the way her father would have done it. Slowly from front to back, her hands making contact with each system in sequence, not checking for problems at this point, but making a kind of contact. "This is what I've done. This is why. This is right." When she was done, she stood at the front of the motorcycle and put both hands flat on the tank. The chrome was cold under her palms, 700 names engraved in silver. Her father's masterpiece, her inheritance. She thought about Blade and his brother Danny, 21 years old with the oxygen gone from his lungs. She thought about Earl, who had sold the bike he'd owned for 30 years to fund this one. She thought about Drift, who had sat in the corner for 2 nights without asking for anything. She thought about Stone, who had opened a gate for a girl who had no credentials and no history, and nothing but her hands and her stubbornness. She thought about her father, who had built this test without knowing if she'd ever come out of faith in something. He couldn't prove the way you have faith in things you love from a distance without certainty that your love is even known. She took her hands off the tank. She turned toward the door. "Go get them," she said to the empty garage. They came in from the compound in ones and twos, and then in groups, filling the garage bay the way water fills a container. Finding the edges first, and then the center, until 50 men stood in a rough circle around the motorcycle, and the air in the room had changed into something that had weight and temperature, and the charge of a moment that everyone present understood was not ordinary. Earl was near the front. Riley had spoken to him only once briefly the previous afternoon, when he'd come to the garage doorway and stood there looking at the disassembled engine with an expression that was equal parts grief and hope, and the dignity of a very old man who has learned not to let his face show everything his heart is doing. He was 79, and he moved with the deliberateness of someone who has made peace with the fact that his body requires more consideration than it once did. He'd been riding motorcycles for 63 years. The bike he'd sold to fund this one had been his companion for 3 decades. He stood now with his arms at his sides and his chin up and his eyes on the motorcycle, and Riley thought that whatever happened in the next few minutes, this man deserved to see it end right. Stone stood at the edge of the circle. He caught Riley's eye and gave her one small nod. Blade was at the back. She'd known he would be there. He stood with his arms folded across his chest and his face arranged in the controlled expression he had been wearing since yesterday's church meeting. Behind it, if he knew where to look, was something older and more exhausted than the performance he was maintaining. Riley did her final visual inspection. Oil level checked through the sight glass. Fuel level confirmed. Electrical connections verified by the indicator, lights cycling correctly when she turned the key to the accessory position. Every external system reporting as it should. She stood at the right side of the motorcycle with the starter button under her thumb. The garage was completely silent except for the ventilation system and the distant sounds of the Nevada morning coming through the high windows. Riley thought about her father, not about the letter or the test or the compounds or the 19 years of waiting, just about the fact of him. A man she'd never met who had nevertheless shaped the shape of her hands and the pattern of her mind, and the stubbornness that had kept her alive through 7 months of sleeping on concrete and had kept her upright through 40 hours of work that should have broken her. He'd given her those things without knowing her. She'd carried them without knowing where they came from. And now they'd brought her here to this garage, to this circle of men, to this machine that was both his legacy and his message, and the only conversation they would ever have. She pressed the starter button. The engine turned over once, twice. On the third revolution, it caught. The sound that came out of the motorcycle was not what anyone in the room had been braced for. Not the scream, not the desperate mechanical shriek that had driven 65 mechanics out of this garage and sent 3 of them away without their pay. What came out of the motorcycle was the sound it had always been meant to make. A deep, authoritative, perfectly tuned V-twin rumble that started in the chest and moved outward from there, that shook the concrete floor in a frequency you felt more than heard, that filled the garage bay with the voice of 1,800 cubic centimeters of custom-built engine operating exactly as its builder had designed it to operate. The turbos spooled up with a clean, rising whistle. Oil pressure climbed the gauge in a smooth arc to its proper position. Temperature nominal, fuel delivery steady, every system reporting correctly, every number where it was supposed to be. 5 seconds, 10, 15, no scream, 20 seconds, and the engine was warming, and the exhaust note was deepening as the oil reached operating temperature, and the tolerances that Riley had rebuilt to her father's specifications began to do exactly what precision tolerances do when their rights settle into themselves, find their equilibrium, become the thing they were designed to be. 30 seconds. Someone in the circle made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes out of a person when something they had stopped believing in suddenly becomes real in front of them. And then another man made a similar sound, and then it moved through the circle like a current finding a path. Earl dropped to his knees. He went down slowly and with the care of an old man's knees on concrete, and he put both hands flat on the floor, and he bowed his head, and his shoulders shook. No one moved toward him because everyone understood that this was private, even in a room full of people, that this was between him and the 30 years he'd spent with the machine he'd sold, and the 2 years he'd spent watching this one sit silent in the faith that had kept him in this club through all of it. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Riley held the throttle steady at a fast idle and listened to the engine the way her father had apparently listened to engines, with her whole attention reading it the way you read something written in a language you've spoken your entire life without knowing that was what it was. She heard nothing wrong. She heard nothing that shouldn't be there. She heard an engine that had been waiting 19 years to say what it had to say and was now saying it perfectly. She looked up. Stone was standing at the edge of the circle with his arms at his sides and his face doing something she hadn't seen it do before. The control was still there, but something had come through it, some real and unguarded thing that the moment had been strong enough to reach past his defenses. His eyes were bright in the garage light, and he wasn't bothering to look away. She looked at the back of the room. Blade was gone. She hadn't seen him leave. At some point between the starter button and now he had walked out of the garage quietly, and the space where he'd been standing was just space now holding the shape of his absence the way air holds the shape of things that move through it. Riley shut the engine down at the 5-minute mark. The silence afterward was the best kind of silence, the kind that has been earned by what preceded it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Stone walked forward through the circle and stood in front of her and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who had worked with his hands for 30 years, and what she hadn't expected was the way he held on for an extra second before releasing, the way a person holds on to something when they're confirming it's real. "You did it," he said. His voice was different, quieter, like he was protecting the moment from too much volume. "Kid, you actually did it." Around the circle, men were shaking each other's hands and gripping each other's shoulders and saying things in low voices that weren't meant to carry. The release of something held for 19 years doesn't happen loudly. It happens in the quiet of people who have been tense for so long that the end of the tension takes a moment to locate itself in the body. Drift stood in the doorway of the garage. He met her eyes and gave her a single nod that meant more than a speech would have. Then Garrett pressed her hand and said, "I'm going to tell everyone I know about this." Then the courier who delivered the bearings at 5:30 in the morning, who had apparently waited around rather than ride back, shook his head slowly and said, "Raymond always said the blood would come back to it." The call came from the south gate at the 40-minute mark. Stone's phone. He listened with his back to the room, and when he turned around, his expression had returned to the version Riley had first seen at the gate, the one that meant a situation requiring his particular set of responses. He pulled Drift aside first. Then he came to Riley. He said it quietly and directly. "Blade left the compound 40 minutes ago. Security tracked him to a gas station 2 miles south. He made 3 phone calls. One of them was to a man named Cord, who runs the Scorpion MC chapter in Carson City." Riley knew the name from 7 months of Nevada street geography. The Scorpions were not a club that operated the way Iron Legion operated. They were smaller, more volatile, held together by aggression, rather than the loyalty that decades of shared history builds. Stone said Cord is bringing 20 riders. They'll be here in roughly 30 minutes. Blade told them Iron Legion was harboring an outsider who had violated neutral ground. "It's not true, but it's enough of a pretext." Riley said, "Is it about me?" Stone said it's about Blade needing the situation to end a way that doesn't leave him standing alone in the desert, having spent 19 years on something that failed. He needs it to burn down. That's what this is. She thought about that for exactly as long as it required thought. Then she said, "Give me the keys." Stone looked at her. The keys were in his vest pocket. He'd taken them from the ignition when the engine shut down. He said, "You've never ridden this bike." She said, "I've never done most of the things I've done in the last 48 hours. Stone looked at her with the expression of a man evaluating something he's not sure he believes in against all the available evidence that maybe he should. He took the keys from his pocket and held them out. She took them. "Get your people to Devil's Throat Canyon," she said. "The road north. Give me a 15-minute head start and bring everyone you can move." She walked back into the garage and stood in front of the motorcycle. In the distance, she could already hear it, not the Scorpions yet, but the compound itself waking up to the situation, voices and boots, and the urgent efficiency of people who have prepared for things like this. Riley put the key in the ignition and turned it to accessory. The instrument cluster lit up clean and steady, oil pressure indicator normal, temperature still warm from the earlier run, fuel full. She thought about what she knew about this bike from 48 hours of having her hands in every part of it. The geometry of the frame, The rake angle of the forks, the way the weight distribution sat with the custom engine in its reinforced mounts. She thought about the power curve of 1,800 cubic centimeters with twin turbos, the way the torque would arrive not as a linear push, but as an event, something that required respect and anticipation. She thought about her father's hands in the photograph, the certainty in them. She swung her leg over the motorcycle. The fit was different from anything she'd ridden before. Higher, more substantial, like sitting on something that has opinions about where it's going rather than waiting for instruction. She felt the weight of it through her seat and her feet and the grips under her palms and understood immediately that this machine was going to require everything she had. She pressed the starter. The engine came back to life on the first revolution. No hesitation, no ceremony. Just the immediate, confident authority of a properly built engine that has been waiting for someone to ask it to work. The garage doors were open. The compound gate was visible at the end of the access road, already opening on Stone's instruction. Beyond it, the Nevada morning was bright and flat and enormous. Riley let out the clutch slowly and felt the motorcycle move forward and felt the difference immediately between this and every other machine she'd ever been on. This was not a motorcycle in the way the borrowed bikes and junkyard runners she'd learned on were motorcycles. This was a distillation of decades of one man's understanding of what this kind of machine could be if you gave it everything you had and held nothing back. She went through the compound gate and turned north. The road was empty in both directions. Desert on either side, the Nevada landscape of red rock and sparse vegetation and distances that made other states feel crowded. The morning light coming from the east was golden and low, and it caught the chrome of the motorcycle and threw it back in moving patterns across the asphalt. She gave the throttle a measured turn. The turbos responded immediately. The acceleration was not the gradual push she'd expected, but something more sudden and total, a compressed instant of physics that pinned her back against the seat and required her to make a rapid series of adjustments, her weight forward, her arms pulling rather than pushing her body, finding the position that worked with the force rather than against it. 60 miles per hour came and went before she'd fully processed 40. She eased back, let herself calibrate, let her hands and her weight find the conversation with the machine that was going to determine whether the next 15 minutes ended with her leading 20 Scorpion riders into a controlled confrontation or wrapped around a Joshua tree somewhere in the Nevada desert. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of 20 motorcycle engines is distinct and carries across open ground. She checked the mirror her father had mounted at a specific angle that turned out to be exactly the right angle for her height, and saw them coming from the south, the Scorpions spread across the road in the loose formation that clubs ride when they're moving with purpose rather than for pleasure. Blade was at the front on a blacked-out Road King, the chrome stripped or painted over anonymous and fast. They saw her. Blade's arm went out forward, the signal to accelerate. Riley gave the throttle what it was asking for. The turbos spooled to full output, and the motorcycle did what 1,800 cubic centimeters of precision engineering does when someone finally stops being careful with it. It went. Not gradually, not in stages. It went in the way that things built by someone who understood what they were doing go when they're finally allowed to be what they are. 100 miles an hour in the time it took her to process that she'd passed 90. The wind at that speed is not wind in the ordinary sense. It becomes a physical presence, a force with intentions, and staying stable inside it requires the kind of total concentration that leaves no room for anything except the road and the machine and the immediate geometry of the next 3 seconds. Riley found that concentration the way she'd found everything useful in her life, not by looking for it, but by needing it badly enough that it arrived. The Scorpions fell back fractionally. Their bikes were fast, but built for different purposes, presence and intimidation, and the long roll, rather than the all-out pursuit. The distance between her and the front of their pack opened from 200 meters to 300, and she used every meter of it. The turn north to Devil's Throat Canyon came up faster than she'd calculated. She'd walked past this junction once 6 weeks ago, heading in the other direction. She knew the turn by its geography. A stand of Joshua trees on the left and a collapsed metal signpost on the right, and then the road climbing immediately into the first of the switchbacks. She made the turn at a speed that required the bike to lean to an angle that her body told her was wrong, and the motorcycle's engineering told her was fine, and she discovered in the longest half-second of her life that the engineering was right. The bike carved through the turn with a precision that her father had apparently built into the geometry of the frame at a level that went beyond calculation into the kind of intuitive understanding of physics that lives in the hands of the best craftsmen and doesn't transfer to paper. She straightened out of the turn and climbed. The Scorpions had made the turn behind her. 20 engines in the canyon acoustics became something enormous, the sound bouncing off the rock walls and filling the air in every direction. She didn't look back again. She watched the road ahead and let the motorcycle do what it was built to do. She saw them at the entrance to the narrowing. 50 Iron Legion motorcycles on both sides of the road parked in the arrangement of people who have done this kind of thing before and know exactly where to be and how to stand and what presence looks like when it's organized. Stone in the center of the road with his arms folded, the morning light behind him. Drift to his left. Earl to his right, the old man standing straight and steady with 63 years of road behind him. Riley slowed and pulled alongside Stone and stopped and put her feet down and felt the engine idling beneath her like a living thing that had decided to rest for a moment. She was breathing harder than she'd realized. Stone looked at her for a second, and she could see him processing what she'd just done and deciding to have the reaction to it at a later time. The Scorpions arrived 30 seconds later. 20 bikes coming through the canyon entrance and finding 50 waiting for them is a specific kind of mathematics that changes the temperature of the air. They spread out and slowed and stopped. The engines died one by one until the canyon held only the echoes and then just the wind. Blade pulled to the front. He was different from the compound. She could see it from 20 meters away. Something had come apart in him during the ride, some structure he'd been maintaining for 19 years, had met the morning and the sound of the motorcycle running and had given way. He looked like a man who has been awake for a very long time and has finally stopped pretending he isn't tired. He looked at the motorcycle under Riley. Then he looked at Stone. Then he looked at the 50 men arranged on both sides of the canyon road. Then he looked at Riley, Crusher Blade said, using Stone's given road name for the first time she'd heard. He said it in the tone of a man making a formal address. "This doesn't have to involve the whole club. My business is with the girl." Stone said, "The girl fixed our bike blade. That makes her family. You want her, you go through all of us. That's not a position. That's a fact." Cord, the Scorpion leader, was a big man with a gray beard and the quality of attention that belonged to people who'd survived long enough to stop needing to prove anything. He was sitting back on his bike, watching the geometry of the situation with the patience of someone who's evaluating rather than committed. Riley noted that. She dismounted from the motorcycle. Her legs were steadier than she expected them to be. She walked forward until she was standing in the space between the two groups, and she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out the medical documents she'd found in the frame alongside her father's letter. She held them up. "I found something in the frame of this motorcycle," she said. She said it at a volume that carried to both sides of the canyon without requiring her to shout. "Something my father left there. Something he wanted to be found when this day came." Blade's jaw tightened. She said, "This is a medical file, Danny Voss, compiled by 3 independent physicians over the course of his illness and the investigation that followed his death." She paused. "According to these documents, Danny Voss was exposed to industrial solvents at 3 separate shops before he became Raymond Cole's apprentice. Progressive pulmonary fibrosis from particulate inhalation, establishing over a period of approximately 18 months prior to any contact with Raymond Cole or any compound Raymond Cole worked with. The damage to his lungs was already complete and irreversible by the time he walked into Raymond's shop. The canyon was very quiet." She continued, Raymond Cole did not kill your brother Blade. The disease that killed your brother was already inside him when they met. What Raymond did was spend every dollar he had saved trying to slow it down, trying to buy Danny more time. The file includes payment records for specialist consultations in 3 states and an experimental treatment program in Houston that cost Raymond Cole his entire savings account. She lowered the papers. He spent the last 2 years of Danny's life trying to save him. Then he spent the rest of his own life trying to figure out how to live with the fact that he couldn't. The silence went on. Cord was no longer sitting back on his bike. He had one foot on the ground and was leaning forward slightly, watching Blade. Blade hadn't moved. She said, "You knew, didn't you?" Not a question. Blade's hands were shaking. She could see it from where she was standing. She said, "You had access to Danny's medical records. You were his next of kin. The original file was given to you, and somewhere in the years after you read it closely enough to understand what it said. But you couldn't accept a truth that left no one to blame. You needed someone to be responsible for what happened to your brother. Because the alternative was that Danny died from an accumulation of carelessness spread across months and shops and situations that no single person controlled, and that kind of loss has nowhere to direct its anger." Blade looked at the ground. "So you chose Raymond," Riley said, "and then you chose his bike, and then you chose 19 years. The Scorpion leader said something to the man beside him in a low voice. Several of his riders shifted. The mathematics of the canyon were clarifying themselves in real time, and the mathematics did not favor having ridden 3 hours for someone else's unfinished private business. Stone took 3 steps forward. He stopped in front of Blade at a distance that was close enough to mean something. "You lied to the club," Stone said. 20 years ago, when you brought the complaint, you already had the file. You already knew the truth, and you presented us with a different version. You've been sabotaging a machine that 700 of your brothers built with their savings and their sweat and their faith. You've been doing it for 19 years in the name of a grief you chose to maintain over the truth." He paused. "And you brought an armed rival club to our doors based on a false pretext, using a girl you never met as your excuse." Blade raised his eyes. "He should have found her," Blade said. His voice was raw and stripped of everything it had been using for cover. He knew she existed. He had months. He could have found her. "He was dying," Drift said from behind Stone. His heart was failing by the time he knew about her. He did everything he could with the time he had left. He built something that found her after he was gone. That was what he had to give, and he gave it. Blade looked at the motorcycle. He looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that has just told you a thing you can't unknow. "I wasted it," he said. His voice had changed completely. The flatness was gone, and what remained was something much older and much more tired. 19 years. I wasted all of it. Riley walked forward until she was close to him. Close enough that she was speaking only to him, not to the canyon. She said, "You lost your brother. That's real. The grief was real. The anger was real. What you did with it. That was a choice, and you made the wrong one for a long time. But you're standing here right now, and the bike is running, and the truth is in the open, and those are the facts of today." She paused. "You can't recover 19 years, but you can stop wasting today." Blade looked at her. For a long moment, he was completely still, a man standing at the exact edge of something, and Riley watched him decide. He turned to Cord. "I lied to you," he said. "I brought you into a club matter under false pretenses. The situation I described to you doesn't exist. This is not your fight, and it never was." He met the Scorpion leader's eyes. "I'm sorry. I owe you for the time and the ride, and I'll make it right. But you should go." Cord studied him for a moment with the patience of a man who has heard a lot of apologies and knows the difference between the kinds. Then he looked at Stone. "We're done here," Cord said. He looked at his riders. "Mount up." The sound of 20 engines starting in sequence is its own kind of statement. They turned in the narrow canyon space with the ease of experienced riders and rode back south the way they'd come, the sound of them fading into the canyon acoustics and then into the desert beyond. When it was gone, there was just wind. Blade stood alone in the road, the Iron Legion on both sides of him, a man who had burned everything he'd carried for 19 years in the space of 5 minutes and was now standing in the ash of it, not sure yet. What came next? Stone said, "Go, Blade. Leave Nevada. Don't come back to the chapter. What happens after that is between you and whatever you can build from here. But you're done here." Blade nodded, slowly, the nod of someone accepting a judgment they've earned. He looked at Riley one more time. He said, "Your father was a better man than I gave him credit for." "I think I knew that. I just couldn't afford to." He walked to his bike. He started it. He rode south and didn't look back, and the sound of his engine was distinct from the desert silence for almost a full minute before the distance took it. Stone turned to the assembled club. He said, "Someone take Earl's bike. Earl, you're riding with Riley to the front of the formation." Earl looked up from the place near the canyon wall where he'd been standing, and his face changed into something that had no adequate description. He walked forward, and Riley held the motorcycle steady while he climbed on behind her, the old man's movements careful and deliberate. And when he was settled, he put his hands on the passenger grabs and sat up straight. Riley looked over her shoulder at him. He said quietly in the voice of someone who has said a thing so many times inside their own head that saying it aloud is almost a formality. "Thank you, girl." She started the engine. The formation organized itself behind her with the efficiency of people who have ridden together for decades. 50 Iron Legion motorcycles in the canyon engines, starting in a wave of sound that built until it filled the space completely. Stone directly behind her, Drift behind Stone. And in the rank behind that, the men who had given what they had to build this machine, the men whose names were carved in silver on the tank under Riley's hands. She led them out of Devil's Throat Canyon. The road north opened into the desert, and the morning light was full and golden. Now the sun properly up the Nevada sky, its deep, particular blue that exists nowhere else in the country quite the same way. She held the throttle steady and felt the formation behind her like a physical thing. 50 engines harmonizing in the way that engines do when they're ridden in close formation, the sound becoming something larger than any individual part of it. Earl's grip on the passenger handles was steady. She rode north for 4 miles. To the high point of the road where on clear mornings you could see 80 miles in every direction, the desert spread out in all its flat, enormous indifference, beautiful and empty and permanent. She slowed and stopped and put her feet down. Behind her, the formation stopped. 50 bikes, 50 engines, 50 men who had trusted an impossible thing and been right about it. The desert was very quiet under the sky. Riley sat with the engine idling and looked at the horizon and thought about her father who had looked at some version of the same sky from the same general desert and had built something impossible out of faith in a daughter he'd never met, who had put her initial next to his in the metal of an engine case in a garage in Reno and believed with the certainty of someone who cannot afford not to believe that she would find it. RC+D. She reached into her jacket and took out the photograph. The hands in it were the same hands that were holding the photograph, the same knuckle shapes, the same scar on the left thumb, the same quality of grip. She looked at them by side and felt the thing she'd been feeling since the moment Stone said Raymond Cole's name in the garage 2 days ago, the thing that had no precise word in any language she knew. Recognition, arrival, the sense of a question that had been open her entire life finally locating its answer. She put the photograph back. Behind her, she heard Stone's bike idle up alongside her and stop. He said, "You're Raymond's daughter," not a question. "Yeah," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the side of her face. He said, "I need you to know something. About the first day you came through the gate, when you pressed that intercom button and said you were there about the mechanic job," he paused. "I knew you weren't like the others. Before you said anything beyond that, it wasn't logical. I just knew." Riley said nothing. He said, Raymond used to say that the right hands find the right work eventually, no matter how many wrong roads they take getting there. He said it every time he hired someone that nobody else would have hired. She heard something shift in his voice. He said it about me when I was 32 and had nothing, and he gave me a job when I needed one badly enough that I might not have survived not getting it. She looked at him. Stone's face in the morning light was the face of someone who has stopped performing for the moment and is just being a person. Older than the controlled exterior suggested, more human in the way that people who have learned to appear invulnerable always are when they finally let it go. He reached into his vest pocket and took out something she recognized. A patch. Not a full vest, just a single patch, rectangular, with the Iron Legion skull and wings logo in silver thread on black. He held it out. "Prospect patch," he said. "You earn the rest, but you've started." Riley looked at the patch in his hand. She thought about 7 months under an overpass in Reno. She thought about a garbage bag on a porch in Sacramento on the morning of her 18th birthday. She thought about 11 foster homes and every night she'd spent in them looking at the ceiling and asking the question that foster ceilings never answered. She thought about a photograph in a desk drawer that a woman named Doreen had never explained and never taken back. She thought about her father's hands in that photograph and her own hands on this throttle and the miles between them that turned out to be 19 years in one impossible machine. She took the patch, she turned back to the road in the desert in the enormous Nevada sky. She said, "Earl, you ready?" The old man behind her said. "Been ready for 63 years, girl." She opened the throttle and led them home. The formation moved south through the desert morning. 71 motorcycles where there had been 50, because some of the men had called others from the compound while the situation in the canyon was still resolving, and those others had come the way people come when something important is happening, and they want to be part of it rather than hear about it later. 71 engines on an empty Nevada highway in the morning, light the sound of them carrying for miles in the desert air, a sound that was its own kind of announcement, its own kind of answer to the 19 years of silence that had preceded it. Riley held the front position and felt the formation behind her the way she imagined her father had always meant for someone to feel it. Not as pressure, not as weight, as the warmth of people who have chosen each other. When they came back through the compound gates, the men who'd stayed behind were waiting in the yard, and the sound the compound made when it understood what had happened, when it heard the motorcycle running clean and strong at the front of the column, was the sound Riley would carry with her for the rest of her life. She parked the motorcycle in the center of the yard and cut the engine. Earl climbed off the back slowly and stood beside the bike and put one hand on the tank on the silver names and left it there for a moment with his eyes closed. Drift appeared from somewhere and stood beside Riley without saying anything. Stone came around the front of the motorcycle and looked at her and said nothing because there wasn't anything adequate to say, and he apparently knew that. Riley looked at the motorcycle, at the chrome that held the morning light and the midnight paint and the 700 names and the skull with wings in silver that her father had carved into the tank, with tools that shouldn't have been able to do that kind of work. She looked at the lower engine case, the spot near the primary drive housing where her father had stamped two characters into the metal 19 years ago. RC plus D, Raymond Cole, plus daughter. She crouched down and looked at the stamp for a long moment. Then she straightened and took the patch Stone had given her and held it in her hands and looked at it. Somewhere in California, in a foster care system that had done its best to make her invisible, there was a file with a blank where her father's name should have been. Father unknown. She'd read those words when she was 12 and sat with them for 3 days straight. She knew now what to put it in that blank. She knew what he'd sounded like from the handwriting in his letter. She knew what he'd looked like from the shape of her own hands. She knew what he believed from the machine he'd built and the impossible faith he'd invested in it and in her. She knew what she'd inherited, not money, not a name in any legal sense, not even the certainty of having been wanted. Because wanting and finding are different things, and he'd wanted her without finding her, and she'd found him without knowing she was looking. What she'd inherited was this: the work, the hands, the stubbornness, the understanding that precision matters and patience matters, and that some problems are only solvable by someone willing to sit on a concrete floor and listen before they touch anything. And a family of 71 people who had watched her earn a thing that couldn't be given, only taken in the way that all the things worth having are only ever taken. She put the patch in her jacket pocket next to the photograph. She would sew it on later in the proper place when she had time to do it right. Her father would have done it that way. She looked around the compound yard, at the flag on the pole in the center, at the walls that had seemed like a prison when she'd stood outside them 4 days ago and now felt like something else entirely. At the men going about the business of a morning that had turned out different than they'd expected. At Earl, who was still standing next to the motorcycle with his hand on the tank, not because he needed to hold on, but because he was choosing to be in contact with the thing his sacrifice had helped build now that it had finally become what it was always meant to be. She walked over and stood beside him. He looked at her sideways with the clear eyes of a very old man who has stopped pretending that things don't matter. He said, "Your father told me once, this was maybe 6 months before he passed, he said, there's a person I'm building this for that I haven't met yet. Wouldn't tell me who. Just said it like it was a simple fact. Like he was talking about ordering a part that hadn't arrived yet, but was definitely on its way." He smiled slowly. "I thought it was a figure of speech." Riley looked at the motorcycle. "It wasn't, was it?" Earl said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Earl took his hand off the tank and looked at it for a moment. Then he nodded once, the satisfied nod of someone who has seen something completed that needed completing, and walked away toward the clubhouse. Riley stood alone with the motorcycle. She put her hand where his had been flat on the tank on the names on the silver and the chrome and the midnight paint that had been built to last longer than the man who built it. She stayed like that for a while. The Nevada morning moved around her. The sun climbed. The flag moved in a small wind that came from the west and brought with it the smell of the desert dust and sage and the dry warmth of a landscape that keeps its own counsel about everything that passes through it. She thought about all the roads that had led here, every shelter that had closed at 6 in the morning, every dumpster she'd gone through with methodical patience, every engine she'd fixed in exchange for a meal, every night under the overpass, listening to the traffic on Interstate 80 and the silence beneath it where her thoughts lived. Every mile of the walk from Reno to this compound with the flyer in her pocket and the photograph against her chest. She thought about her father making that same walk in spirit in the opposite direction, through the same desert, carrying something she now understood as the weight of knowing what you want to give someone and not knowing how to reach them. The road between them had been 19 years long. It had ended here, in a garage in Nevada with grease on her hands and an engine that finally said what it had always meant to say. She took her hand off the tank. She turned toward the clubhouse where breakfast was being made because someone had started a grill and the smell of it was coming across the yard in the morning air. She walked across the compound and through the door. Behind her in the yard, her father's motorcycle sat in the morning light and was exactly what it had always been. A question answered, a letter delivered, a road that had finally reached its end.